So there were three boys that were on the playground one day doing what boys do, which included bragging about their dads. First boy says, my dad scribbles a few words on a piece of paper, calls it a poem, and they give him $100. The second boy says, come on, my dad scribbles a few words, calls it a song, and they give him $200. The third boy says, guys, my dad scribbles a few words, calls it a sermon, and it takes 8 people to collect all of the money. Now that's a bad preacher joke, yes. And yes, it's a segue to a sermon about money. Nobody leave. I'm as uncomfortable talking about money as you probably are hearing me about it. That's because there are simply too many preachers on TV asking for your money, and there are too many stories about preachers running off with your money, and there are too many bad jokes about all of these on the internet. Money is one of those subjects that I think we would all rather avoid, but it's one of those subjects that we can't avoid because Scripture doesn't avoid it. In fact, while there are roughly 500 verses on prayer in the Bible, and somewhere around 500 verses on faith in the Bible, there are 2,000 verses about money and possessions in the Bible. And many of those words come from the lips of Jesus. In fact, 1 out of every 10 verses in the Gospels is about money and possessions. That includes Luke 12, which I invite you to turn to now. This is clearly an important subject. In fact, it might surprise you to hear this, that not only are there 2,000 verses on money and possessions in Scripture, Jesus says more about money and possessions than he does about heaven and hell combined. This is clearly an important subject. Now, the thing about money is it's neither good nor bad, but I think we do have to recognize the fact that money has enormous potential to do good and to do bad. You probably know stories of people who have come into money and who have done incredibly good things by being generous with that money. You may also know stories of people who have come into money and had their lives devastated by it. One of the surprising things about lottery winners is there are very few, if any, happily ever after stories. And that's just on an individual level. We could talk about the tremendous power of money for good and evil on a more corporate scale. In fact, I think we have to recognize that right now. Like so many of the issues in our country come from the fact that so many of our leaders are owned by money. The money that keeps them elected and keeps them from passing common sense things like gun reform. And I don't mean to get political, I'm just saying, can you recognize the power of money for good or for evil? Money isn't neutral. It's powerful, and that's why we're going to spend a few minutes talking about it today. And we're going to do so using this parable of the rich fool as our guide. I invite you to hear these words from Jesus. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So Jesus calls the man in this parable a fool because the man fails to understand the power of money. Of course, we have to recognize that the man is not alone in that. Everyone makes foolish decisions when it comes to money at times, and unfortunately, Christians aren't immune to it. In fact, one of the most sobering facts that you may hear today is that while some of the richest Christians in all of history live in the United States today, American Christians give away the least percentage-wise in all of history. And the wealthier American Christians get, the less they give. This is something that Christian Smith and Michael Emerson and Patricia Snell talk about in their book, Passing the Plate. One of the things that they say is that if committed American Christians, that is not nominal Christians, that is not people who show up to church on occasion, but committed Christians, people who are weekly invested in a local church. If just committed Christians tithe, and a tithe is 10%, nothing more. If committed Christians tithe, give away 10% of their income, they say that we could do this, quote, finance 5 billion microfinance loans, close the funding gap in eradicating polio, start 1 million new clean water programs and 10,000 AIDS prevention centers in sub-Saharan Africa. Provide all the funds needed for a worldwide campaign against malaria. Provide food, clothing, and shelter for all the 6.5 billion refugees in Africa and Asia and the Middle East. Sponsor 20 million needy children worldwide. And that is just scratching the surface. We could do all of that and still have billions left over. The authors of this book conclude that reasonable, generous giving from American Christians alone would literally change the world. Insert bad preacher joke here. Like, the good news is we have the monies to literally change the world. The bad news is it is still in our pockets. What do we do with this? And maybe you're asking, are you going to talk about how much we should give to this church? Yeah, we'll get there in a minute. I mean, we will. But what we're talking about is bigger than the local church. It's bigger than this church. It's bigger than the concept of tithing. What we're actually talking about here is a matter of our hearts. Because the fact of the matter is, God doesn't really want your stuff. He wants our hearts. Of course, as Jesus famously says elsewhere, where your treasure is, there your heart is also. These things are somehow inextricably linked. How we spend our money or don't spend our money or give it away actually says something about our relationship with God. Not that we earn it by this, but it says something about what we're holding on to. So we're going to spend a few minutes in this parable today, because we should all ask some questions about what the status of our hearts is, and that is whether we are committed Christians or whether we're here on a holiday weekend window shopping Christianity when, I'm sorry, but the preacher's talking about money. Whether we have millions or whether we're living paycheck to paycheck, this is one of those sobering questions that we should ask. Where's my heart? And what does my stuff have to do with it? Now, the thing about the parable of the rich fool is it's not an exhaustive discussion of everything that Jesus says about money, but I do think it highlights three important principles. Namely, that we should be wise with what we have in the bank. 2, that we should be generous with what we have in the bank. And most importantly, that we are worth more than what we have in the bank. Said another way, or maybe said directly to you, you should be wise with what you own. You should be generous with what you own. But you are worth more than what you own. Let's start with the idea of wisdom, namely that we should be wise with the things that we own. There should be a wisdom in how we spend our money, and I would add, and how we save our money. And I say that against the backdrop of, I recognize the fact that the man here wants to build bigger barns to store his stuff, and I realize that God calls him a fool for doing so. But the problem isn't that the man wants to save, the problem is the man doesn't want to share. And the problem is the man assumes that everything he has is his, that he has earned everything. I mean, did you notice the pronouns in everything that he says? I will say to my soul, I will build bigger barns for myself. I will store my goods. I will say to my soul. Like, at the core of this, I think what Jesus is reminding us is that everything we have is a gift. And yeah, we work to earn things, but even the ability to work and to earn is a gift. And the calling of the Christian life is to be wise with God's gifts. Now we'll talk about how that applies to generosity in a moment, but let's just take a minute to talk about how it applies to saving. I do think that Jesus is warning us that it is foolish to look out for ourselves alone. But I don't think he's saying it is foolish to look out for ourselves, that we shouldn't look out for ourselves at all. There is wisdom in preparing for the future, not to prevent us from being generous now, but allowing us to be generous going forward. to actually save for the sake of being generous for the long haul. Now, some of us aren't able to do that. Even though some of us may have more money than we ever dreamed of, it's just that no one ever taught us to spend it wisely or how to save it. Then again, some of us may be suffering the consequences of less than wise spending in the past. Maybe we racked up debt and now we can't save. Or maybe just some of us are dealing with those unfortunate realities of our world, that we're paying down student loans, which were necessary. Or we're stuck trying to deal with these out-of-control housing prices in this area. Or maybe there's some other factor. Whatever the case is, some of us may be living in fear of what happens if they decide to downsize at work. Or if the market crashes. Or some unexpected bill comes our way. There's some wisdom in saving, because it can allow you to absorb the blow there. It can allow you to continue being generous. That's why I think there's wisdom in saying if you aren't saving now, you should start. And if you can't because you're in debt, well then you should be wise in trying to figure out how to pay down your debt so that you can save and so that you can be generous, which, by the way, will mean some changes to your lifestyle. There is wisdom in saving, and there is a call to be wise in how we spend and save and use our money. Of course, the key thing, though, is the main point. That we would not just be wise with what we have in the bank, that we would be generous with it. And saving is meant to lead to generosity, which is the core of this parable. That Jesus calls us to be generous with every gift that God gives us. Did you notice the man in the parable says he plans to eat, drink, and be merry? It's this kind of typical Epicurean phrase. It could just as well be an American phrase, right? And in some sense, there's something good about that we should enjoy the gifts of God. They are gifts to be enjoyed. It's just that we forget that there's a second half to that Epicurean phrase. Dave Matthews reminded of us in a song that eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Well, God echoes that, but he kind of makes it personal, and he says, tomorrow you will die. And that's what makes you a fool. He says to this man, like, you've gathered all this stuff that you cannot take with you. Someone has said that's why you don't see U-Hauls behind hearses. You can't take your stuff with you. And it's not a successful life. It's not a wise life. It's not a good life to get to the end and say, look at all this stuff that I got that I can't use. The fact is, God gives us gifts not so that we might hoard them for ourselves, but so that we might be conduits of His grace. In other words, that God blesses us that we might actually bless others. The calling of the Christian life, the wisdom of the Christian life, is to learn to be generous. Jesus calls it being rich towards God. Elsewhere, he calls it storing up treasures in heaven. We might just say it's investing in things that matter. Which could include those things that those authors talk about in that book. Eradicating treatable diseases, providing education for those who need, dealing with refugees, people who don't have the ability to eat, drink, and be merry. There is wisdom in those things, and there's a calling to be generous, to give towards those things. Which, by the way, means generosity wherever it happens. The calling to be generous does not mean that you can only give to quote-unquote Christian causes. It means you can be generous wherever God calls you. That means you can give to the United Way or the Red Cross or whatever you think aligns with your values. By the way, you could even give to politicians who you think might actually make some things happen, although I think I would have to recognize that may not be the wisest strategy. Because regardless of how great someone's character is, the system has issues, and the system tends to win. The key thing is be generous wherever you see the opportunity to invest in things that matter, things that speak to the ways of Jesus. Of course, I think that does include the local church. You were waiting for me to say that, weren't you? Now, I know it can sound like a plea for self-preservation, but this is actually wise, because it is in the local church, the people that you belong to, that I think you can actually make the greatest impact. The reason being is you can give to organizations and you can trust that they do good things, and I think that they do. But you don't have any personal investment unless you work for these organizations or you volunteer with them. You probably don't sit on the board and get to make decisions about where they go, but you know what? That actually happens in the local church. Not at every level. Trust me, you don't want to be in every conversation about how the money is going to be spent. But you should absolutely be involved in those conversations about how they're spent. It's why we push membership. It's why we vote on our budget. It's why we invite you to ask, and we implore you to ask questions about who we're supporting and where those dollars go to, because this is our money. And we want to give it to organizations that invest in the things that matter, that align with our gifts and our passions and the recognition of needs that we see in the world. There is wisdom in giving to your local church because there is shared responsibility and accountability and ownership. And by the way, there's the ability to use these funds to care for one another. Because as much as we want to be giving money out the door, there are times when an unexpected bill comes, or they downsize at work, or some other contributing factor happens and we have to help each other. We do that quietly, but we do it generously. Because this is our money, and we care for the world around us, but we also care for each other. In fact, God says, this is how all men will know that you're my disciples, if you love one another, if you care for one another. What I'm saying is there is a call to be generous, but there is wisdom in being generous to the people that you belong to, so that as people who belong to each other and who follow Jesus, we might be able to bless the world around us. You heard one example this morning. We talked about Bethany. You heard us talk about Jubilee Reach. These are opportunities that we get to bless the world. So be wise with what you have in the bank, and be generous with what you have in the bank. But there's a third point, and I think the third point is the most important point, as important as the other points are. The third point is the most important because, you know what? You can be as wise as anyone. You can save and be prepared for the future. And you can be generous. You can do an enormous amount of good. But if you did this third point wrong, it doesn't matter. In other words, you could bless the whole world and forfeit your soul. Because the third point is that you are worth more than what you own. This third point actually comes right before the parable. It's in the opening of the section we read, that someone comes to Jesus and they say, hey, Jesus, can you settle this dispute about an inheritance? In other words, can you get into this argument about money? And Jesus tells the parable. Before he says the parable, he says this: watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. At first, he warns about the power of money, right? That you can get caught up in this love of it, this whole idea of greed. But the main point I want you to see is that life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. And I want to highlight that because this is so counter to what we live and practice, isn't it? I mean, we live in a world that tends to assign value to people based on what we own and what we do. In fact, we even have an expression for that. It's called net worth. Banks do it. And Forbes magazine does it. They look at people's assets and they figure out what you are, quote, worth. But of course, it isn't just organizations. We all do this. You know, you see someone else at work, spending a lot of money, and you start wondering if they're getting paid for this more for the same work that you're doing. Or you see a friend roll up in a new car, or you hear them talk about this wonderful vacation that you went on that you can't afford to go on, and you wish you were them. Or maybe you're watching celebrity moms' bodies bounce back from childbirth in just a matter of weeks because they're working with their celebrity trainer, and you feel not only slightly flabby but slightly less worth it because you can't afford a celebrity trainer or a nanny so you can work with your celebrity trainer. You wish you had those Seahawks tickets, or that house on the water, or that second house which happens to be on the water, or whatever. We all do this thing. We see what others have and we feel less than. This is why a recent cartoon in the New Yorker said, money is life's report card. That's the way of the world that we live in. But what we find Jesus saying, what we find throughout the pages of Scripture, is that Jesus says, your bank account is not a referendum on your existence. You're worth more than what you own. You're made in the image of God. You are uniquely created by Him and for Him. And whether you know it or not, He has been pursuing you your entire life. In fact, He stepped into this world for you. And He laid down His life for you to liberate you, not just from your sin, but from everything that enslaves, from everything that you can't let go of. This is why the reminder here is that God doesn't want your stuff. He doesn't want your money. He wants you. And He wants to liberate you from the things that you're so desperately holding on to. This is what Henry Nouwen prayed about when he said, "Dear God, I am so afraid to open my clenched fist. Who will I be when I have nothing left to hold on to? Who will I be when I stand before you with empty hands? Please help me to gradually open my hands and discover that I am not what I own, but what you want to give me." This is what the core of this parable is about. This is what all those 2,000 verses about money and possessions in Scripture is about. Is that you are not what you own. You are worth so much more. In fact, you are worth Jesus Himself, who gave Himself up for you. Yes, to liberate you from your sin. Yes, to set the world on a new trajectory where all will be made right in the end. All of those horrible things that we are witnessing in the world right now. But also, too, that we might even now begin to discover that we can let go. We don't have to cling to our stuff. That we can open our hands and let God use our gifts and our talents and our passions and our possessions to share the good news with the world. What would it look like to believe that? What would it look like for you to be open-handed with the things that God has given you? Not just your money, but including your money. With everything, though. What would it look like to be open-handed with that? What might God do? Now, I can imagine you may be asking yourself some questions. Yeah, what would that look like? But you may be asking some other questions like, okay, I get what you're saying, JD, so how much should I give? And could you give me a breakdown of how much I should give to the local church compared to organization X? No, I can't do that. That's between you and God. Now, I can give you some guidance. You know, there is this principle called tithing, which is 10%. But you know what? That's commanded in the Old Testament. It's not spoken of in the New Testament. There's no percentage given. There's just a call to generosity. I can't tell you what to do. I can encourage you to pursue generosity. 10% might be a great place to start. And you can decide where that goes. If that feels like too much or too little, give more. Just don't look down on those who can't give as much as you. The key thing is, if you aren't being generous, you should start. And you should start now, because it doesn't get any easier. This is what all the statistics say, is that the more we have, the less generous we are. That's the American problem, right? Which is incredibly ironic, because we're a land that prides itself on being free. In fact, that's what everyone talks about on Memorial Day weekend. Oh, but how many of us aren't free of our stuff? Be wise with what you own. Be generous with what you own. Recognize that you are more than what you own, and be free. Would you pray with me?